We now like to consider what happens to monetary policy when the interest rate set by the central bank hits the lower bound of zero, where it can't go below zero, and how a concept of forward guidance is one of the proposals central bankers have considered to deal with this problem of the zero lower bound. Let's first look at what happens when a policy rule hits the zero lower bounds. You can see how this happens over time. You recall a policy rule is a description of how the instruments of policy, in this case the short-term interest rate or the federal funds rate, adjust according to what's happened in the economy. We want to consider a couple of different rules here to examine this lower bound, because it really depends on which rule you are considering or the central bank's considering. So there's two rules listed here. The first is an equation. It says the interest rate is equal to the inflation rate plus a half times the GDP gap, y, plus a half times the difference between inflation and 2, which is the target inflation rate, plus a constant 2. And this is a rule which was proposed 21 years ago, and it's during periods when the Fed followed this, things looked pretty good. There are other rules proposed, and I want to consider another one which has been discussed a lot, in particular by a member of the Federal Reserve Board who has been nominated to be the new chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen. And this is very similar, but it's different in an important way, as you'll see. So the second one says that the interest rate should equal the inflation rate plus 1 times the real GDP gap. Again, plus 0.5 times the difference between inflation and 2, and then plus a constant 2. Now, there is a difference between these that shows you how responsive the Fed is in changing its interest rate depending on the level of GDP compared to potential GDP. The second rule is much more responsive, much more aggressive to changes in real GDP compared to potential. The second one is less responsive and therefore less aggressive with respect to changes in GDP from potential. So let's consider an example and then consider a chart. Here's an example just to show you how this works. So suppose the inflation rate is 1.5% at an annual rate, and suppose the GDP gap, y, is 5%. Then you can see what the interest rate will be for these two different rules. So rule 1 is where the coefficient is 0.5. So you multiply 1.5 times the inflation rate, which is 1.5. Then you take 0.5 times the gap, which is minus 5. You're below potential GDP, plus 1. And plugging in the numbers, that gives you an interest rate of 0.75, just a little bit above 0. The other one is you plug in the numbers, and note now that minus 5 GDP gap is multiplied by a larger number, 1 rather than a half. It's twice as large. And so now you're going to be subtracting 5 instead of 2.5, and that gives you a federal funds rate of 1.75. So in the second case, you're below the zero bound. You can't go there. You can't go below 0, so you got to do something else. In the first case, you're okay. You're not really below 0, so that's a question of whether zero bound is making any difference at all. So that's really the fundamental thing, are you using a policy rule that takes you below 0, in which case you got to think about what to do, or using a policy rule which is not taking you below 0, at least by not by much. So let's look at some data to show how this works over time. These are data that were put together by a Wall Street economist using information from the Fed and from forecasts of the Fed. And so let's look at this carefully. There's 3 lines. One is the light gray line, which shows you the interest rate, federal funds rate, set by the Federal Reserve in periods from 2005 to 2013. And then there's a forecast at this point into 2015. The blue line is that person's estimate of what the interest rate would be if Rule 1 were followed. That's with the small coefficient. And the red line is what the interest rate would be if Rule 2 were followed. That's the larger response coefficient. And then as you move over to the right into this forecast period, you see dashed red and dashed blue lines, those are the forecasts of what the interest rate would be if Rule 2 were used and you put in the forecasts of the Fed for inflation and real GDP into the future. And the blue line is what Rule 1 would say if you plug into Rule 1 the Fed's forecast for inflation and real GDP. And then finally, there are these little marks, dots or X's, and those are the descriptions or reports of what each member of the Fed's Open Market Committee, the Federal Open Market Committee, are saying they think the interest rate should be in the future. So it's their preference for what the interest rate would be. And as you can see, in much of 2013, most of them are at the zero, which is actually what the rate is, except for one person. And then in 2014, there's a few more people above zero. And in 2015, virtually everybody is above zero. But what's most important about 2015 is most of them are below what the policy rule would say, either the Rule 1 or Rule 2. Okay, so now let's, with this information, which is a lot of information, think of what the implications are. So if you think the red line is the right rule, then as early as 2009, something else should be done than just follow the policy rule. You can't go negative. If you think the blue one is right, well, it hardly goes below zero at all. Holding the rate at zero or near zero probably would have been just fine. And so that doesn't bring you into confronting this issue of the zero bound. So it's quite important to try to stress what the right policy rule is. Now, if it does hit the lower bound, as the red one does, then you say, what should the Fed do? And there's really three options. One is to switch away from that interest rate rule and use a money growth rule. We mentioned that Milton Friedman long ago proposed a rule for the Fed, which is just to keep the growth rate of the money supply constant, say M2 definition of the money supply. So that's a good rule. It was proposed and analyzed for a long time. Why not just go back to that rule, just keep the money growth constant, and let the interest rate go where it would be, probably hugging around zero in this case. That's the constant growth rate rule. So that's a proposal. That actually was not followed by the Fed in this period. The Fed instead did a couple of other things. One was the quantitative easing, which we've been discussing in previous lessons. These were the large-scale purchases of bonds and mortgages by the Fed. The reason for that is they tried to lower long-term interest rates. You recall when you buy bonds, you raise their price, and since interest rates are inversely related to the price, that drives the interest rates down. Same idea with mortgages. It would drive mortgage interest rates down, so that was their purpose. And you would see that this idea is important because even though the short-term interest rate is at zero, can't go below zero, you'll have the longer-term rates, 5-year, 10-year, 30-year mortgages. Those will be remaining above zero, so if the Feds can take some action to lower those, not just the short-term rate, not just the federal funds rate, that very short-term rate, but also the longer rates, it feels it can help the economy, actually shifting the aggregate demand curve towards the right. So that was a rationale for quantitative easing, and it also is a second option for the Federal Reserve to take in this circumstance. There's a lot of controversy about whether quantitative easing was effective in this desire. There's a lot of questions about how it will be undone in the future. There's a lot of questions about how you can operate a rule-like policy with quantitative easing, since the magnitudes are so large and their impact is so uncertain. Nonetheless, it is an option which the Federal Reserve took in response to this zero bound being hit by at least the red policy rule that they looked at. And then the third is forward guidance. And forward guidance is a subject of great interest in itself for monetary policy. All it means is that the Fed indicates what its interest rate policy will be in the future, what the interest rate itself will be in the future. It says this in different ways, and here's some examples. Back in 2003, the Federal Reserve wanted to tell the markets it was going to hold the interest rate at zero for a while, so it called that a considerable period. Wasn't that precise, but just a general idea the interest rate would be held not at zero, I should say not at zero, but at 1% during that period. So it wasn't zero, the considerable period had the interest rate at 1%. And measured pace was a little later. The interest rate was rising, but the Fed said it would rise as a measured pace. You can see both of this in a diagram that we've examined before. The red line is the demarcation between the considerable period, and the measured pace period. And you can see the considerable period was the Fed signaling it was going to hold the interest rate at 1 for a while. And then the measured pace was a signal it was going to raise it more slowly. And interestingly, both were descriptions of the Fed felt they needed to state, in some sense because the interest rate was lower than they normally would have been setting it according to the so-called Taylor rule. But these are just examples now of forward guidance. Other cases of forward guidance are more recent and more serious, if you like, more deliberative. One was a commitment to keep the interest rate at 0 until 2015, a particular year. And the Fed said that for a while, and it was hoping to give the markets the sense the interest rate will remain low, literally at 0, for a number of years into the future. It was saying that in 2011, 2012, things like that. Another way to give forward guidance is to say the interest rate will remain at 0 until unemployment hits 6.5%. So this was stated when the unemployment rate was well above 7.5%, and so by the Fed saying it's going to be 0 until unemployment hits 6.5%, the markets could say, oh, well, we think unemployment is going to come down at this pace, and therefore get a sense of when the Fed will begin to raise the interest rates above 0. Again, forward guidance is what's being described here. Yet another example of forward guidance, certain central banks, Sweden and Norway, for example, actually just plug in their forecasts of inflation and GDP gap and other variables if they're in their policy deliberation, and list and show in a chart what the policy rate will be into the future. So that's actually a much more detailed form of forward guidance. So these are all examples of forward guidance. Now, what's the reason for doing this? Well, it's always good to be transparent, and some people argue the more transparency the central bank can provide about its actions, the better. So to some extent, describing in the best way it can where it wants to take the interest rate is along the lines of more information, more transparency. But there's a much more specific and particular rationale that forward guidance why forward guidance has been used. And that is to reduce the long-term interest rate. Now, what's going on here? How would a promise to keep the short-term interest rate at 0 or very low into the future affect long-term interest rates? The key idea here, and it underlies forward guidance policy, is that long-term interest rates, say the interest rate on a 10-year bond or a 5-year bond or a 3-year bond, is influenced by expectations of future short-term rates. And you can think of this as kind of in a logical way. Imagine that you're deciding to buy a long-term bond that pays, say, 3% interest over the next 5 years. And then someone tells you that the alternative is to get 0 interest rate short-term year after year. So year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, or 5, you get 0 interest rate. So you have a choice. One is 3, the other is 0. Well, pretty clearly, people are going to say, hey, that 3% interest rates on the bond looks pretty good, so they're going to go buy those bonds. And as they buy the bond, they're going to raise the price, and as you know, that's going to drive the interest rate down below 3%. So the expectation of those future short-term interest rates being so low, at 0 in my example, will bring about forces in the market that drive the longer-term interest rate down too. And that is the mechanism that is being brought into play by the forward guidance. And so to summarize, the promise of lower short-term rates in the future should reduce long-term rates today. That's what the logic says. And indeed, that's what the Federal Reserve has in mind with this kind of forward guidance. Now, one problem with this is it creates a time inconsistency problem. And one way to see that is to go back to the graph that illustrates the differences between the promises that the Fed is considering into the future about the interest rate versus what the interest rate would be if it followed a policy rule in the future. So if you look over to the far right-hand side of this diagram, the year 2015, you see various FOMC members' guesses or forecasts of where their interest rate will be. And they're all lower than either of those policy rules. And so effectively and that's forward guidance. That's the promise to have rates lower in the future than they otherwise would be. Otherwise would be along the blue or the red dashed lines. And they're hoping that that brings long-term rates down now. It's now being 2013, the promise in 2015 to have zero short rates or low short rates, depending on which person you're looking at there in the diagram. That's going to bring the long rates down. And the time and consistency question is, well, when 2015 comes, is that promise going to be held to? Because at that time, it's going to be better for the economy, according to these policy rules. And by this time, it's a normal state of affairs. There's no zero bound at issue for either policy rule. So will it be the thing that the Federal Reserve will do in the future? Will those policymakers, whoever they happen to be, decide to fulfill the promise made 3, 4, or 5 years ago, even though it's not the right thing to do for the economy at that point? And that's the time and consistency issue that forward guidance brings into play. And one of the reasons it's tricky, one of the reasons it's controversial. To conclude, if you think that the zero bound is binding, as it is in the case of the red line, as it was in the case of the red line, then there are these three options to take. None of them are foolproof. None of them are easy. If you think that the zero bound was not binding, at least by much, many of those things should not be of a concern. And so not only do you have here a description of the alternatives, the three options and their issues, you have the rationale of when you do not need consider those three options. Thank you very much.